There is a courtroom in your mind, and it is always in session. You sit at the bench, gavel in hand, presiding over a defendant who cannot speak. The accused is your past self, the version of you who made that decision 3 years ago, or last month, or yesterday. You know how the story ends. You have seen the evidence, and from where you sit now, with perfect clarity, you cannot fathom how that person, how you, could have been so blind. I should have known better, you say, bringing the gavel down. It was so obvious. But was it? I am a cognitive narrator, and my purpose is to explore the architecture of our inner worlds, to understand why our minds build these prisons of the past, and to find the key that might unlock the door. We are all haunted by our past decisions. The relationship we stayed in too long, the job offer we declined, the warning signs we missed, the words we said that we cannot take back. These moments live in us not as neutral memories, but as evidence, proof of our foolishness, our weakness, our fundamental inadequacy. We replay them obsessively, each viewing another session of this internal trial, another opportunity to condemn the person we used to be. The prosecuting attorney in this courtroom is relentless. They present the facts with surgical precision. Here is what you knew. Here is what you ignored. Here is the catastrophic outcome that anyone with half a brain could have predicted. The case seems airtight. The verdict appears inevitable. Guilty. But what if I told you that this entire trial is rigged? What if the courtroom itself is built on a cognitive illusion so powerful, so pervasive, that psychologists have spent decades trying to understand its machinery? What if the reason you cannot forgive your past self is not because you were uniquely foolish, but because your brain is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, and in doing so, it is lying to you about the past? This is the phenomenon that psychologists call hindsight bias, though that clinical term hardly captures its devastating emotional power. It is the cognitive trap that makes the past feel inevitable, that transforms uncertainty into obviousness, that allows us to look back at a fork in the road and wonder how we could have been stupid enough to choose the path that led to pain. It works in concert with other mechanisms of mind, the way we reconstruct our memories, the counterfactual scenarios we generate, the stories we tell about who we are, to create a version of history that feels true but is fundamentally distorted. And it is destroying your relationship with the person you used to be. In the next half hour, we are going to dismantle this courtroom brick by brick. We will examine the cognitive machinery that makes the past feel obvious when it was actually opaque. We will explore why your memory is not a video recording but a story constantly being rewritten. We will understand the emotional engine of what-if thinking and why it feels so impossible to let go. And finally, we will discover how to become not just the judge of your past self, but their defender, and ultimately their liberator. Because the truth is this: you did not have the information you have now. You were not the person you are today. And the fact that the outcome is now visible does not mean it was ever predictable. Your past self deserves a fair trial, and the prosecutor in your mind has been withholding evidence. Let me show you what they do not want you to see. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was 32 when she met Marcus at a friend's wedding. He was charming, attentive, and shared her passion for hiking and documentary films. They started dating, and within 3 months, there were small signs that something was not quite right. He would sometimes go silent for days without explanation. He was evasive about his past relationships. Once she saw him lose his temper at a waiter over a minor mistake, a flash of rage that disappeared as quickly as it came. Sarah noticed these things. She felt a whisper of unease, but Marcus always had explanations that seemed reasonable enough. He was going through a stressful period at work. He valued his independence and needed space sometimes. He had just been having a terrible day, and there were so many good things: the way he made her laugh, the future they talked about building, the feeling that she had finally found someone who understood her. 2 years later, after Marcus's controlling behavior had escalated into something that made her friends worried and her therapist concerned, Sarah ended the relationship. And that is when the real torture began. Not the breakup itself, but the retrospective trial. Sitting alone in her apartment, Sarah played the early months over and over in her mind. The warning signs were not whispers anymore. They were sirens. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have missed what now seemed so glaringly, painfully obvious? Every friend who had expressed concern, every moment of unease she had dismissed, every explanation she had accepted, all of it was evidence of her willful blindness, her desperate naivety, her fundamental failure to protect herself. "I should have known," she told me when we spoke. "I did know. The signs were all there from the beginning. What is wrong with me that I ignored them?" Nothing was wrong with Sarah, but everything was wrong with her memory of the decision. This is hindsight bias in its purest, most destructive form. The psychological literature defines it as our tendency, once we know the outcome of an event, to believe that we knew it all along, that the outcome was more predictable than it actually was. Baruch Fishoff, the psychologist who first systematically studied this phenomenon in the 1970s, called it the knew-it-all-along effect. He demonstrated through elegant experiments that once people learn the outcome of an event, they cannot accurately remember their previous uncertainty about that outcome. The past becomes restructured to make the present feel inevitable. But hindsight bias is not just a laboratory curiosity. It is a fundamental feature of how memory works, and to understand why Sarah, why all of us, blame our past selves so harshly, we need to understand a deeper truth. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. When you remember a past event, you are not pressing play on a video file stored somewhere in your brain. You are rebuilding that memory from fragments, pieces of sensory information, emotional associations, schemas about how the world works, and crucially, everything you have learned since. Every time you recall a memory, you change it slightly, incorporating new knowledge, new feelings, new interpretations. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus spent her career demonstrating this phenomenon. In her studies, she showed how easily false information introduced after an event could become woven into people's memories of that event, altering what they were certain they had seen. Your memory of your past decisions is being contaminated by your knowledge of their outcomes. When Sarah remembers meeting Marcus, she is not accessing the memory of her actual experience at that wedding. She is rebuilding a version of that memory with 2 years of painful knowledge baked into it. The unease she felt, which at the time was genuinely ambiguous, a small signal amid so much noise, is now amplified into a klaxon she clearly chose to ignore. His explanations, which at the time seemed plausible within the context of a new relationship, now appear transparently manipulative. The red flags that were pink at best in the moment are now crimson in her memory. This is not Sarah rewriting history out of dishonesty. This is her brain doing what brains do, using current knowledge to reconstruct the past. And because she now knows how the story ended, her brain cannot recreate the uncertainty she genuinely felt. The fog of that decision-making moment, with its incomplete information and genuine ambiguity, is burned away by the clarity of hindsight. The result is a devastating gap between two experiences. The experience of making the decision then, and the experience of evaluating that decision now, and into that gap falls all of her self-compassion. But there is another mechanism at work here, another gear in the machinery of self-blame. Because it is not enough that the outcome feels obvious in retrospect. We also need to understand why Sarah's mind keeps returning to this trial, why she cannot simply accept what happened and move on. This is where our memory system intersects with what psychologists call counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is the mental simulation of alternative realities, the endless what if and if-only scenarios that haunt our regrets. What if I had listened to my friends? If only I had trusted my instincts? What if I had ended things after that first red flag? These alternative timelines feel vivid and real, running parallel to our actual history like ghost tracks beside a railway line. The human mind is extraordinarily good at generating these counterfactuals. We evolved to learn from mistakes by imagining how things could have gone differently. In small doses, this is adaptive. It helps us extract lessons from failures and adjust our future behavior. But when combined with hindsight bias, counterfactual thinking becomes toxic. Because once the outcome feels obvious, once your brain has reconstructed the past to make the warning signs seem unmissable, the counterfactual scenarios feel not just possible, but easy. Of course you could have avoided this pain. The path was clear. You just did not take it because of some fundamental flaw in your character, your neediness, your naivety, your weakness. Sarah generated countless counterfactuals. In one, she had declined that second date and avoided the whole relationship. In another, she had confronted Marcus about the waiter incident and seen his true nature immediately. In yet another, she had listened when her best friend had expressed concern 6 months in, saving herself from the worst of it. These alternative timelines were so vivid that they felt like real possibilities she had somehow squandered. Each one was another count in the indictment against her past self. But here is what Sarah's prosecuting attorney would not tell the jury. None of those counterfactuals account for what she actually knew in the moment. The version of Sarah at the wedding did not have access to the information that the version of Sarah conducting the trial possesses. She was making a decision under genuine uncertainty, with incomplete data, with hope and fear, and the messy complexity of human emotion all tangled together. The outcome was not written yet. The future was not inevitable. The past felt open because it was open. It only feels closed now because you have reached the end of the story and are reading it backwards. But knowing this does not make it stop, does it? You can understand intellectually that hindsight bias is distorting your memory. You can recognize that your past self did not have your current knowledge. And still, the trial continues. Still, you lie awake at 3 in the morning, prosecuting the case again, unearthing the same evidence, reaching the same verdict. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Why? Why does this cognitive loop feel so impossible to break? The answer lies in understanding that hindsight bias is not just a cognitive error, it is an emotional engine. And like all emotional engines, it runs on fuel that your mind finds irresistible. The fuel is control. Human beings have a profound psychological need to believe that we have agency over our lives, that our choices matter, that the outcomes we experience are the result of our decisions, that if we are smart enough and vigilant enough, we can protect ourselves from harm. This need for control is so fundamental that we will distort our perception of reality to maintain it. Hindsight bias, paradoxically, serves this need. When you blame your past self for missing the obvious warning signs, you are actually doing something psychologically protective. You are preserving the belief that you have control, because if the signs were obvious and you missed them, that means you can avoid missing them next time. If the outcome was predictable and you failed to predict it, that means outcomes are predictable and you can get better at predicting them. The alternative, that you made a reasonable decision with the information you had and things simply turned out badly, is far more terrifying. Because that would mean the universe contains an element of randomness, that terrible things can happen even when you do everything right. That control is sometimes an illusion. So your mind makes a trade. It sacrifices your past self on the altar of the illusion of control. It says, yes, I was foolish, but I have learned, and I will never be foolish again. This feels painful in the moment, but it is less painful than accepting true uncertainty. This is why the counterfactuals are so seductive. Every what-if scenario is a world where you had control. In the counterfactual universe, you see the danger coming and step aside. You speak up at the crucial moment. You trust your instincts and save yourself. These fantasies are agonizing, but they are also empowering in a twisted way. They suggest that safety was available to you. You just failed to grasp it, which means that next time, if you are better, smarter, more vigilant, you can grasp it. But there is another layer here, another reason the trial continues. For Sarah, the relationship with Marcus was not just a failed relationship. It was evidence in a larger case she was building about her own identity. She had a core belief, probably formed long before Marcus, that she was somehow defective in her judgment about people, that she was the kind of person who always chooses the wrong guy. The relationship with Marcus was not an isolated data point. It was confirmation of a narrative she had been telling herself for years. This is where the cognitive loops we have explored, hindsight bias, reconstructive memory, counterfactual thinking, connect to something deeper, our need for our experiences to mean something. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We cannot simply let events exist as random occurrences. We need them to fit into a story about who we are. And if the story we have been telling ourselves is one of inadequacy, we will unconsciously seek out evidence to support it. Sarah's retrospective judgment of her relationship with Marcus was not just about that relationship. It was about confirming her existing narrative. I am someone who ignores red flags. I am someone who does not trust her instincts. I am someone who gets hurt because I am fundamentally flawed in my ability to judge character. The hindsight bias gave her the evidence she needed. The counterfactuals showed her all the points where a different, better version of her would have made different, better choices, and the loop continued, reinforced by its own internal logic. This is what makes self-blame so sticky. It is not random. It is serving a purpose. It is keeping a narrative alive. And narratives, even painful ones, provide a kind of comfort. They make the chaos of life feel orderly. They give us an explanation for our suffering. They tell us why. But here is the cost. The narrative is a prison, and the longer you reinforce it through these retrospective trials of your past self, the stronger the bars become. Every time you replay that memory and conclude that you should have known better, you are not learning from the past. You are entrenching a story about your inadequacy that will shape how you approach the future. You are not protecting yourself from future harm. You are guaranteeing that you will carry this wound forward, letting it color every new decision with the same fear, the same mistrust, the same certainty that you cannot rely on your own judgment. The trial is not helping you. It is ensuring that you remain the person the prosecution says you are. And this is where we must make a choice. Because the cognitive machinery we have explored, hindsight bias, reconstructive memory, counterfactual thinking, is not going to simply disappear. Your brain will continue to operate this way. Evolution did not design your mind to be fair to your past self. It designed it to learn from experience, even if the lessons it extracts are sometimes distorted. But you are not at the mercy of these mechanisms, because there is one aspect of your psychology that the prosecution has been concealing from the jury, one piece of evidence that changes everything. You can rewrite the story. There is a concept in psychology called narrative identity, the idea that human beings understand themselves not as a fixed essence, but as a story being written over time. You are not a static self, but an evolving narrator, constantly constructing and reconstructing the story of who you are from the raw material of your experiences. This is not a metaphor. This is, according to researchers like Dan McAdams, who have spent decades studying personality and identity, literally how the self works. Your identity is the story you tell about your life, about the events that shaped you, the decisions that defined you, the turning points that made you who you are. And crucially, this story is not set in stone. You are both the protagonist and the author, and the narrative is always available for revision. For Sarah, and for all of us trapped in these retrospective trials, this is the key that unlocks the prison door. The story of her relationship with Marcus, the one where she was blind, foolish, and culpable, is not the only story that can be told about those events. It is simply the story that hindsight bias and her existing narrative about herself made most available, most compelling, most consistent with what she believed to be true. But there are other stories in the same facts. Here is an alternative narrative. Sarah was a woman entering a relationship with hope and openness. She noticed moments of concern, as any thoughtful person would, and she made reasonable assessments based on the information available at the time. Marcus was skilled at providing explanations that were plausible within the context of early relationship development. When the pattern became undeniable, not in retrospect, but in actual real time, Sarah took action to protect herself. She sought support from friends and therapy. She ended the relationship. She survived. In this story, Sarah is not foolish. She is human. She is not blind. She is someone who tried to see clearly in a situation deliberately obscured by another person's manipulation. She is not weak. She is strong enough to have left. Same facts, different story, and the difference is everything. The work of revising your narrative is not about lying to yourself or engaging in positive thinking that denies reality. It is about accuracy. It is about giving your past self the fair trial they never received, one where the prosecution has to play by the rules, where hindsight is not admissible as evidence, where your past self gets to testify about what it was actually like to live in that moment of uncertainty. This is the practice of self-compassion, though that term has been so overused in self-help contexts that it has lost some of its radical power. Kristin Neff, the researcher who has done the most to bring this concept into mainstream psychology, defines self-compassion as having three components: treating yourself with kindness rather than harsh judgment, recognizing that suffering and failure are part of the shared human experience rather than evidence of your personal inadequacy, and holding your painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness rather than over-identifying with them. Applied to hindsight bias, self-compassion means this: when you catch yourself in the middle of that internal trial, when the prosecutor is presenting the case of your foolishness with what seems like overwhelming evidence, you pause. You step down from the bench and stand beside your past self. You become their defender, and you speak on their behalf. You remind the court that memory is reconstructive, that the certainty you feel now about what was obvious then is an illusion created by knowing how the story ends. You present evidence that your past self could not have presented: testimony about the fog of uncertainty, the incomplete information, the genuine ambiguity of the warning signs when they were fresh. You challenge the counterfactuals by asking whether those alternative choices were actually easy in the moment, or whether they only feel easy now. You question whether the narrative of inadequacy is serving you, or whether it is simply a story you inherited that has never been true. This is not a one-time trial. This is an ongoing practice because hindsight bias is not going away. Your brain will continue to reconstruct the past with the distortions of current knowledge. But each time you catch it happening, each time you pause and offer your past self the compassion of context, you weaken the grip of the old narrative and strengthen the new one. And slowly, something shifts. The memories do not change. The events themselves remain fixed in history, but their meaning changes. The story you tell about them changes, and because your identity is the story you tell, you change. Sarah told me something 6 months after we first spoke. She said, "I still think about the relationship sometimes, but it is different now. I do not feel angry at the person I was. I feel sad for what she went through, and I feel proud that she got out." The events had not changed, but the narrator had learned to tell the story with more kindness, more accuracy, more compassion. And in doing so, she had freed herself from the prison that hindsight bias had built. Here is what I want you to try. Think of a decision from your past that you have been prosecuting, a choice you made that led to pain, to failure, to consequences you now regret. The trial that plays on loop in your mind, with its seemingly airtight case for your foolishness. Now conduct an experiment in rewriting. First, acknowledge the illusion. Say to yourself explicitly, "I am experiencing hindsight bias. What feels obvious now was not obvious then. My memory has been reconstructed with knowledge I did not have. This is not self-deception. This is accuracy." Second, step into your past self's shoes, not as you remember that person with current knowledge, but as they actually were in that moment. What did they know? What did they not know? What were they feeling? What were they hoping for? What constraints were they operating under? What did the future look like before you lived it? Third, offer testimony on their behalf. If your past self could speak in their own defense, what would they say? Let them speak. Listen. And finally, ask yourself, what narrative have I been using this event to confirm? What story about my identity have I been reinforcing by condemning my past self? Is that story true? Is it useful? Is it the only possible interpretation of my life? You might find that the prosecutor in your mind has a rebuttal for everything. That is okay. You are not trying to win the trial in a single session. You are simply introducing reasonable doubt. You are reminding yourself that there is more than one story, more than one interpretation, more than one way to understand what happened and what it means about who you are. And over time, with practice, the narrative shifts, not because you have convinced yourself of a lie, but because you have given yourself permission to see the truth that hindsight bias obscured. Your past self did the best they could with what they had. They were not all-knowing. They were human. They were you, doing the impossible work of living forward through time with imperfect information and uncertain outcomes. They deserved a defender, and now they have one. The courtroom in your mind does not have to close, but you can change your role in it. You can step down from the prosecutor's table and the judge's bench. You can become what your past self needed all along, a witness who tells the truth, a voice that speaks with compassion, an advocate who understands that the past was lived in uncertainty and can only be judged with fairness from that same place of not knowing. The gavel does not need to come down one final time with a verdict of guilty. It can rest silent while you tear up the charges and walk out of the courtroom altogether, hand in hand with every version of yourself you have ever been, finally offering them all the grace of being human in a world that demands certainty but only offers fog. This is the path forward, not forgetting but remembering more accurately, not excusing but understanding, not erasing your past, but changing what it means, not condemning your past self, but freeing them, and in doing so, freeing yourself. Because you cannot move forward while dragging the weight of all those guilty verdicts behind you, and you cannot become someone new while reinforcing the old narrative of inadequacy with every retrospective trial. The prosecutor has had their turn, the defense has presented its case, and the jury, which is you, only you, always you, gets to decide what the story means. Choose the story that lets you live. Choose the story that recognizes hindsight bias for the cognitive illusion it is. Choose the story where your past self was doing their best in the fog, and that is enough. Choose freedom. If this exploration resonated with you, if you found yourself sitting in that courtroom recognizing your own internal trial, I would love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found value in this deconstruction of how our minds trap us in blame, subscribe to continue this journey into the architecture of our inner worlds. We are in this together, trying to understand the machinery of consciousness that binds us, and in understanding it, learning how to be free. Until next time, be kind to the person you used to be. They were doing the best they could, and so are you.